So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by generative AI. And there is a lot of magic and mystery around what that term means. We hear AI used a lot. Today, we're going to be talking particularly about a type of AI called generative AI. Generative AI has a number of different subsections, one of which are large language models. And that is actually the area that we're really going to be focusing on today primarily. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about how large language models work in hopefully very simple terms. But it's useful to acknowledge that there are these other types of generative AI that are out there. The difference between generative AI and things like machine learning or data science that you may have come across before is that generative AI can create content. Rather than being able to do analytics, things like clustering and regressions and mathematical tools, generative AI can create brand new content. Often that's text, but it can also be used to create images and audio. That audio could be songs, or it could even be duplicating real voices. We're also seeing recently that video, very convincing video, is being created by generative AI as well. And we're not going to talk about the nefarious uses of generative AI, but more about how it can be useful inside your business. So useful to remember, generative AI is a broad term for a type of machine learning that can create content. And we're going to talk about large language models, which are things like ChatGPT, which you've probably seen and maybe played with yourselves. I'm just very, very quickly going to explain a little bit about how large language models work, because this is important to some of the conversations that we'll have later. The first thing to know about large language models is that use of the word large at the beginning is really, really important. Large language models are exactly that. They are extremely large. They have been fed an enormous amount of information. The original models for ChatGPT were trained on the content of Wikipedia and taking the content of large libraries to train the models that underlie the technology that we use today. When we talk about the models, what they actually do is they break that text that they have been trained on into a set of numbers that can actually be represented in space. Now, this space isn't space as we would think about it. It's actually very large space with many, many, many dimensions. But this is really important because what large language models do is they find proximity of concepts. So when they're understanding the words, they find the proximity of concepts to other concepts. If I give you an example of how that works, when you give an input to a large language model, something like how does GenAI work, what the large language model does is takes those words. It is actually much more complex than this, but broadly it takes those words and it tries to understand what the meaning of that sentence is. When it's done that, so it might understand that GenAI is a particular concept, what it will do is it will look inside its database of knowledge and it will try to find words and concepts that are similar to GenAI in order to put together a reasonable, probable response to the input that you're giving it. And so in this case, if you ask, how does GenAI work? What will happen is it will give a response something like generative AI or GenAI refers to ... Something that's really significant about the way that generative AI works is that unlike more traditional computing, it is probabilistic, not deterministic. And those long words are really important to what we're going to look at today. With something like Excel, or when you run a computer program, what typically happened was you could be sure of what the output was going to be. But because of the way that large language models work, they work on what's the most probable outcome, depending on exactly what you've given it, with some randomness inside the answer. And this can make them slightly untrustworthy. It's led to them being accused of hallucinating, which is not a bad term, but it means that we have to use attention and caution when we are actually using large language models in our work, just to watch out for whether the answer that it's giving us is truthful or believable. But we're not going to dig deep into any more of the technology.